Hello, and welcome to Nerdverse Unshuffled, a geeky podcast where we introduce you to the language of board games. We are your hosts, Jacques from Heerden and Fayyaad Hendricks. First, I guess we need to introduce ourselves. I'm Jacques. I'm one of the founding members of nerdverse.co.za. Like most people, I used to play board games when I was a kid, and then, unlike a lot of people, I suppose, I rediscovered them later on, often playing with a group of friends who kind of got together every so often, and we shared our board game collections with each other. But in the last 5 years, I've taken it a lot more seriously, mostly because I was introduced to a lot of very complicated games by my friend and co-host.
Hi, I'm Fayyaad, and been in modern board gaming for about the last 10 years or so. And I was pushed down this rabbit hole when a friend gifted me a copy of Ticket to Ride. And it has been an absolutely wild ride on the board game train since then. But my interest in it and in the terminology and all of the metagaming stuff around board games is because I have a background in psychology, and I have been fascinated by the concept of play, by the concept of fun, and what people find interesting. Why do people continue to play and lose board games and still find it fun and come back to it again and again and again,
Yeah. Well, I mean, you said you were just saying now about being pushed down the rabbit hole, but I suspect you weren't putting up too much of a fuss
Oh,
or
no,
too
no,
much
not
of
at
a
all.
fight.
I already had weights tied to my feet when I was pushed.
Well, to be fair, you did kind of tie those onto yourself.
Yeah,
As they were handing the ticket to ride.
absolutely.
But okay, so that I suppose that brings us to the first question of the podcast. So why a podcast about board game jargon? Why the language of board games?
So, firstly, board games are becoming a lot of a bigger business than you think, and more people are joining the hobby every single year. So, it's been an absolute explosion of new board games because, look at, for example, between the years 1930 to 1939, that's an almost 10-year span, there were 859 new games that we know of that were released. And you contrast that with 2021 alone, where there were more than 4,000 new games, and in 2022, just over 5,000 new games. And, look, this number is still small compared to video games, televisions, and movies, So I think you've got the numbers on these.
Yeah. So according to IMDb, and this took a bit of figuring out, but in 2021, around the world, there was 12,516 feature films, 1,104 video games, and 13,392 TV shows and TV miniseries. So that's still, towering numbers in comparison to board games. But the sheer number of board games that have been added in the last 2 years.
Absolutely. That's 10,000 board games the last 2 years, right? And I don't even have 2023's numbers yet.
Yeah. And the thing is, I don't think I have played more than 1,000 board games in my life.
We are in the platinum era of entertainment, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. It is a staggering amount of content that you could be consuming. Obviously, you're limited by the amount of time that you have and the amount of money that you have.
I'll get to that point later.
And the amount of energy that you have. Speaking about money, so Kickstarter is one of the big places where board games have really exploded in the last couple of years.
Kickstarter have just passed over $7 billion in funds raised for projects, right? And about 1.5 billion of that went to tabletop board games in the 14 years that they've been around. And I mean, that's a staggering amount of money.
Yeah.
According to the own records, they've listed over 36,000 different board games, in 14 years.
Yeah.
And just under 24,000 of those got fully funded and released to the public. So you're never going to play all of those.
So just in terms of the broader industry,
Yeah.
the board gaming industry is worth almost 25 billion US dollars, and it's still growing. In fact, it's supposed to hit a value of about 30 US billion by 2026. That is a staggering amount of money.
It is. But it does bring a problem, that we'll talk about a bit later on, about the amount of board games there are. Again, why a podcast about board game jargon, right? I think just the big thing is that, board games are a lot of fun, possibly on the same level as video games in terms of fun, or even more so in my biased opinion.
Well, it depends on the board game. It depends on the video game, but I would say they're roughly on par at the moment.
No, so I mean, look, we didn't start out with the games that we play now. Modern board gaming has come a long way, but we've started to kind of hit a plateau in a lot of respects. Once again, we'll talk about that in a short bit, but it does point to the way that video games have changed over time in terms of how they present the game to people. The same thing has happened to board games, and people's tastes in games have changed over time. And just the more that you know about what the options are and how things work and what people mean when they talk about certain games, the more informed you are, that just it's easier for you to find what you want and what you'll enjoy.
Yes, and also, I mean, as we've played more and more varied board games, and as people are designing and producing and releasing and making available all of these different games, we've discovered lots of better games to kind of go on, explore and develop. But that also takes a lot of learning. I mean, learning a new board game, you end up actually having to learn quite a lot more than just simply the rules of this particular game. You end up learning a lot about like where modern board gaming is going. Maybe there's a new aspect that they're introducing in this particular game. Maybe they're changing things up just a little bit.
Yeah.
And you kind of need to keep up with that kind of stuff if you're going to be like exploring new games on a regular basis.
Oh, but I mean, thankfully there's options, and once again we'll talk about that a bit later on. But again, so why this podcast? Okay, so I think one of the big things is because there's so many new people coming to board gaming, and because so many they get faced with this wall of new words, and what we felt was missing was just a beginner friendly introduction to new board games, to all the words that we use, and just nice friendly. We're friendly people. Board gamers tend to be friendly people mostly, and we wanted something similar to introduce people to all the new words.
Yes, I mean it can also just be really overwhelming, especially when you're starting to watch a couple of more board game focused YouTube channels, and you're reading more reviews, and as you start exploring some of the descriptions on the boxes themselves, like it can very quickly get to a stage where you're struggling to kind of keep up and just make sense of what all this information is sort of coming at you very quickly.
It's interesting to see it happen in real time, because we recently had someone new join our group who's completely new to board games. And, she said, hold it, you're speaking a lot of words and I don't know what they mean. And so being able to, give her a gentle introduction to what we're talking about is, the goal of what we're going for.
Exactly. And also, I mean, this is obviously a hobby that both of us like a lot and we care a lot about it. But as you were just saying now, talking to people who are really into a subject can become very off-putting and intimidating, especially when no one is explaining anything properly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's easy to assume knowledge on somebody else's behalf. So a lot of times, I think what we're going to have to do in this podcast is spell things out in a way that may see, if you're familiar with some of these terms, it may seem a little bit um,
Obvious.
obvious, but you'd be surprised at how often an obvious point needs to be repeated or clarified or actually just
Yeah,
explicitly stated.
absolutely.
So we didn't start out knowing this much, and we just want to share and make it possible for you to empower yourself with all of this knowledge.
Absolutely. I think the other point to make, though, is that, like you said earlier, is that board games have been undergoing an evolution and they've been changing over time. And I mean, you look at the stuff that people talk about, from their past. You ask people, oh, can you name, 10 board games? And if you're not someone who's in the hobby, and they're going to struggle to name anything more than, say, Monopoly, Snakes and Ladders, Cluedo, uh, Catan, is that thing?
Yeah, it is. It is. Speaking as someone who's only really gotten into heavier games in the last 5 years, I can fully attest to this. But I can also attest to the other side of it, which is it does get easier. And
Yeah,
as you learn terms, it does make things easier. But we'll get to that later on as well.
absolutely. So, look, so a big thing about the way that there's this contrast between older games and newer games, right? Is that a lot of the older games, especially traditional games, there's little in the way of meaningful decisions. You were rolling dice, for example, and the dice dictated a lot for you. And I mean, you look at a game like Snakes
Catan.
and Ladders, which could which could literally run itself without players being at the table because you're not making any decisions. The dice is doing it all for you. But modern games are packed to the rafters with completely meaningful decisions. There's so many ways of playing a game, so many ways of approaching the decisions and the strategies, and a lot of them, there's not a single dice to be found in a lot of modern games.
I mean, I suppose we can just sort of summarize that point by just saying that older games did have a lot of activity without necessarily giving you a lot to do.
Yeah, that's
There
exactly
wasn't
it.
that you didn't have to think that much. If you were playing a game that rewards problem solving and conceptual thinking, there was often a lot of luck involved
Mm.
still. So you'd have to roll to get to the right place.
That does lead
Yeah.
to one of the odd things about games and games in particular, games in general, and board games in particular, is that they are still largely seen as children's activities, right? You
Mm.
There is a negative perception, whereas with the modern board gamings, the majority of the people playing them are adults.
The other reason that it is aimed more at adults is because adults actually have more, free money to spend. They do have more disposable income. So you can sell games and specifically aim them at families, but there's going to have to be an adult that buys them
Yeah, absolutely.
generally. So it makes sense. But there's also, I mean, I think the other thing that also kind of drives a lot of this is that there is so much like investment of energy in this. I
Mm,
mean, so many of the people who work on board games and make the board games that we love really care about it. I mean, they get really
yeah,
excited about things and they want to improve their own work like every time that they're releasing a new game. And that kind of also builds up this momentum of, well, how can we make this more complicated? Or how can we make this more challenging? Or how can we improve this aspect of it?
yeah,
So you do end up getting a lot of diversity evolving out of the games themselves. But that
yeah,
also means, from a consumer perspective, that it becomes so much harder to keep track of all this newness and all the bits of jargon that gets attached to this hobby as it grows. It's almost like this giant ball of of fun that's rolling down a hillside made entirely of jargon,
Yeah,
and it just sort of ends
absolutely.
up collecting all this stuff.
You know, one of the interesting things about the board games, though, is that if you play it once, for a lot of games, you won't have seen everything that this game has to offer you, right? You sometimes need to play it, you know, four,
Yeah.
five, a dozen times. And as you play it, you know, new things keep on emerging for you as you play. Whereas a game like, for example, Snakes and Ladders, Monopoly, you know, one play is all it takes for you to have seen everything this game has to show you. A game, you know, something more modern like, you know, Hansa Teutonica, you could play this game like, you know, 8, 9 times and you will discover something completely new every single time you play it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we
Yeah.
absolutely love about the modern board games is that there is so much mental stimulation and there's so much value to be had in terms of the time that you spend with it getting to know the game.
Yeah. So just to give people a bit of context, Fayyaad and I, we both play in a board game group where we play every Friday night, but generally we'll play a new game almost every week. Almost. It's gotten better. We are sort of bringing games back for a second go or a third go or whatever. Most of the time we're playing new games most of the time. And one of the things that's happened sort of on the side is that groups of us have kind of split off and started playing the same game over a number of plays.
So, I mean, that being said, right, there is a place for jargon, right?
Yes.
Because you know what, it can be intimidating, it can be confusing, but there's a reason that these words and terms exist because they're kind of a mental shorthand for a lot of people for talking about the things we love. And look, we don't want you to be scared off by all these, you know, really fancy sounding words, or sometimes not even a fancy sounding word. It could be just a word that you've heard before, but you've never heard it in a particular context, right?
Yeah.
We want to help you use this jargon. We want you to help you use those tools to make board games easier to choose, easier to play, easier to learn about, and, you know, by extension, easier to enjoy.
Yes, exactly.
So the other side of the jargon, right, is that it does create that sense of community and it makes you feel like you're part of something because you understand the terminology, you understand what people are talking about. You know, so just by that understanding of what people are talking about, you have a sense of belonging. But it also means then that, you know, if someone's trying to explain a game to you and they're using these shorthand terms, you understand immediately what's being spoken about without them having to go into the long, drawn out definition of what it is we're talking about.
Yeah.
It also creates a sense of familiarity with how games work. And a lot of games work in a lot of similar ways, right? But if you've played a lot of games, a lot of different games, a lot of the same terminology will apply to games.
Yeah. I think that is something that I've definitely experienced as someone exploring games at a much faster pace than I was before. It's just learning what some of those words are and then associating them with particular games.
So, I mean, a part of what we're trying to provide to you, or trying to, is, you know, just good consumer information, right? Because knowledge is power, as Francis Bacon once famously said. And, you know, consumer knowledge does mean you have consumer power because, look, face it, board games are not cheap. It is absolutely not a cheap hobby. You know, you're going to play some insane prices for some of the games.
Yeah, they are ludicrous prices.
I mean, Gloomhaven, for example, right? It's easily, you know, 105 odd US dollars, which is about 3,000 South African rand. And not everyone's going to be able to afford that sort of game. You know, even though that game will provide you with at least a year's worth of entertainment, it's a lot to pay for a single box of entertainment. And the second part of it is what we were referring to earlier on in the episode, is that you are never, ever going to be able to play everything that was produced in a single year, right? I mean, like I
No.
said, 2022, 5,000 games. And that means you're going to have to play, what, over 14 games a day for the whole year. Just able to get through that. No, you can't. It's impossible.
And I mean, then that's assuming that you're gonna have the time to just play games and not do
Yeah,
anything else, and also that you're going to actually still enjoy playing 14 new games a day by say February. Never
yeah,
mind December. Like if I know what I feel like after like the fourth new game of a month. Never mind a week.
yeah.
You know, if I've been playing four new games over the space of a month, I'm like, okay, can we play something I've played before, please? But just as a an aside to this, I mean, you don't have to spend a lot of money on board games to actually
Yeah,
enjoy board games. There are digital options so you can play on your PC or your phone. You can either play one particular game or you can get something that you could play a whole variety of games on. So it is possible to do this for less money than actually going out and buying the physical board game. But the process of, I mean, the actual activity of going out and buying a physical board game that you play around the table with friends it's a very different experience to playing online. And you might not enjoy playing online. Maybe you love it. Maybe it's like, okay, well, the setup time is a lot less. I can play with anybody from everywhere across the world. If I've got a friend in Canada, I can play with them as long as we're awake at the same time of day.
yeah,
Again, we're not pushing people just to buy board games. This isn't the podcast about which board games you should buy,
yeah.
but it is focused on giving you the tools that you need to understand more about the board games that people are talking about when they talk about board games.
Absolutely that, yes. And I mean, look, the other side of it is like you said, you don't even need a group of friends to be able to play board games with, right? You look at, like you say, the online options. You can play against, any random opponent around the world at any time, on any number of the digital websites that allow for board games. And there are a lot of
Yeah,
sites that
yeah,
play modern board games and newer stuff as well. But even then, right, especially post COVID pandemic, there are a lot of games that support, a party of one. You can literally play these games by yourself
mm,
for the cerebral enjoyment of the puzzle. And even if a game does not come with a single player mode, there are a lot of people online who are making, turning games that have, that accommodate a lot of players and, writing ways of allowing one player to play them. It's very cool.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, on that subject, we are going to have an episode about play modes in the near future where we discuss games that involve lots of people and games that involve one person or games that involve two people and everything in between.
I mean, that brings us to the question of, okay, why should you care what we think? Why should you care about what we're telling you? And the short answer is you don't.
Yep.
So we're not going to focus on our favorite games much. We will speak about them every now and again, but it's not going to be the main focus of this podcast. We're not going to be talking about which our favorite, jargon terms are. This is about, giving you information and tools.
Yes. And basically, the way that we want, the way that I conceive of this helping an end consumer is basically just by giving you an idea when you're looking at this shelf of games and you're going, I'm looking for something fun. I have this many people I'm going to be playing with. This is my budget. This is the kind of thing that I enjoy. or this is the thing that kind of seems intriguing.
This is how long I wanted to take.
Yeah, which game do I want the owner of this board game store to maybe explain and even possibly give me a chance to play?
Yeah.
Just having those words and having the terminology ready to hand so that when someone starts explaining something to you, you can already start to make those decisions about, okay, well, this isn't really what I'm looking for, or that sounds like fun, but I don't know if the people I want to play with are going to enjoy that kind of thing, or that's not kind of it. That's exactly the experience that I want around the table, and it just makes like I mean, I suppose we've been saying this a lot during the episode, but basically just being able to make those choices.
Good decisions.
So that's just a very short, hopefully, hopefully we didn't ramble too much, but hopefully that's a short introduction to what this podcast is, what we're going to be talking about, and the basic way that I think it will help you as an end consumer who is exploring this hobby, but also just to give you a little bit of insight into what's coming next. So the next episode we're going to be talking about is going to be about mechanics. So that's one of the more basic terms that you're going to find a lot in board game discussions. So roughly the way that an episode works is we're going to read you an extract from our fancy book about board game jargon, which we're currently in the process of editing the last version of. So we're going to read you out the definition of the term. We're going to have a discussion about what the term means, have to explain a little bit in more detail. We're going to look at some examples of board games, and then we'll look at ways in which this specific jargon term will help you to make decisions. So either figuring out whether a game is for you or finding out how knowing this word will give you perhaps a new appreciation for a specific board game, or help you to explain why a specific board game appeals to you. Sometimes that also is just very helpful to be able to tell people, well, I really like worker placement games, or I hate worker placement games. And either way, just having the vocabulary will help you, we hope. Thank you for listening. You can follow us on various platforms and join the conversation on Discord. Links in the episode description wherever you found this podcast. You can find articles and discussions about the terms used in this podcast over at nerdverse.co.za. You can also find articles on a host of other subjects, including tabletop role-playing games, interviews, events, and how-tos. Your hosts were Jacques van Heerden and Fayyaad Hendricks. Music editing and producer, Fayyaad Hendricks. Executive producer, Jacques van Heerden. Unshuffled is a Nerdverse Productions podcast.